I earned my degree online at Arizona State University. I chose to get my degree at ASU because I knew that I'd get a quality education, they were recognized for excellence, and that I would be prepared for the workforce upon graduating. To be associated with ASU, both as a student and alum, it makes me extremely proud, and having experienced the program, I know now that I'm set up for success. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hello, and welcome to this throwback episode of Our Fake History. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, what's going on here? A throwback episode at this time of year in this economy? Yeah, I know, it's unusual, but it's part of something new that I'm going to be doing with the Our Fake History feed. New episodes of Our Fake History are going to keep coming every 2 weeks on schedule, just like they have for the past 9 years. But when I've finished a series, just like the Mozart trilogy that I just wrapped up, I will be releasing a throwback episode on the week that would have traditionally been an off week. The effect is that you're just going to get more Our Fake History, not less. Every time I release a throwback, I'll also include a little introduction like the one you're hearing right now, reflecting on the show that I'm throwing you back to. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, dude, can I just scroll back in the feed to hear the old shows? Yes, that's very true, but you would be surprised how many listeners out there don't do that. We are now approaching 200 episodes of Our Fake History, and the back catalog has gotten large enough that newcomers are sometimes daunted by it. I know this because I get requests all the time to do topics on the show that I've already done. So hopefully these off-week throwbacks will bring some attention to the stuff in the back catalog. Now, to be clear, I'm only going to be doing these between series. So if I have an ongoing series, each part will drop 2 weeks apart, and you should not expect a throwback in the weeks in between. Why? Well, this is a choice I made as a podcast listener and fan. I know many people like to binge a series once it's complete. I really didn't like the idea of an ongoing series in the feed being broken up by a throwback episode. To me, that just seemed messy. Also, if you're binging a series and you have your app set to just play the next episode, I thought it would be annoying if something random popped up between parts 1 and 2 of a series. I'm sure some of you wouldn't care, but it's the kind of thing that would bug me if I was listening. So, throwback episodes will only happen between series. And, by the way, if you don't know my personal rule, no series will ever run longer than 3 parts. I've been so dedicated to that little guideline that you might have noticed that part 3 of the Mozart series became epic at over an hour and a half. Anyway, I hope you enjoy having a little extra in the feed going forward. This week, I'm throwing you all the way back to episode 2. This was an episode that I recorded and had in the can for a few months, even before I launched the show. It's so early in the Our Fake History run that you'll notice that many of the show's hallmarks haven't even really taken shape yet. The show is a tight half hour, which seems kind of adorable, given that now most eps are easily an hour. I keep the cold open on this episode very tight at only 1 minute and 30 seconds. Fans of the show know that now I really like to use that opening section as a proper chapter of the story that I'm telling, so those have gotten pretty long. You'll also notice that I don't give a nice big hello after the theme music. I hadn't settled on that little thing yet. If you're a longtime listener, I'm sure you'll notice all sorts of other differences in the production of the show. For me, it kind of feels like watching an episode from the first season of The Simpsons. It's the same show, but it's a little less self-assured than it would become. With that said, I wanted to share this podcast again because It was an important step on my way to actually launching the show. I remember listening to this episode while I was on a drive. At that point, it was just an MP3 that I was using as a demo for a potential show. I hadn't even put it up on the internet yet. When I got to the end of it, it was the first time I had heard one of these prototype shows and thought to myself, you know what? I think this is actually good. I think the internet could hear this. I still think this episode is solid. In fact, I think I could maybe learn a little something from the brevity that I used to bring to these early shows. I'm also releasing this now because it segues nicely into the next series of episodes. This episode is, of course, about Nero, one of Rome's most notorious emperors. The next series is going to be on an emperor who rivals Nero as one of the most loathed rulers in Roman history. I'm speaking, of course, about the Emperor Gaius, better known as Caligula. So, hopefully the tales of Nero's excesses will whet your appetite for more Roman debauchery on the next episode. I hope you enjoy this, and now, without further delay, here is episode 2 of Our Fake History. Did Nero really fiddle while Rome burned? The Great Fire that swept through Rome in 64 AD was the 9/11 of the ancient world. It was a scarring and destructive event that struck a city that was arguably the world's financial and cultural heart. In the ensuing days after the disaster, the shocked populace looked around in anger and despair for answers. What was the cause of this disaster, and who was to blame? Canny politicians were quick to use the event to justify dubious power grabs, and marginalized religious groups soon saw themselves scapegoated and at the mercy of an enraged populace. But also like the World Trade Center attacks in 2001, rumors quickly began to circulate that the whole event had been an inside job. Perhaps there had been a vast conspiracy behind the fire, a conspiracy that went right to the top. Could it be that the Emperor Nero had set the fire himself and had delighted in watching the eternal city burn? Did the emperor actually play the fiddle while Rome burned? This would become the truther conspiracy of the ancient world, and it would enshrine Nero's demonic reputation for generations to come. But how could Nero have played the fiddle if the fiddle was centuries away from being invented? This is Our Fake History. Episode 2. Did Nero really fiddle as Rome burned? Hello, and welcome to Our Fake History. My name's Sebastian Major, and this is the podcast where we look at historical myths and try and figure out what's fact, what's fiction, and what is too good a story not to be told. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the myths that surround one of Rome's most notorious emperors, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, or Nero to us. Nero has one of the most horrible reputations of any leader in human history, and that's really saying something given the number of monsters and psychopaths who've managed to grab onto the reins of power over the centuries. Nero has been remembered as the ultimate example of absolute power corrupting absolutely, and in some traditions, he is presented as nothing less than the Antichrist. But does Nero really deserve this reputation? Most of what we know about Nero comes from ancient historians who had a vested interest in painting the emperor in as negative light as possible. Even more problematic is that there are no historical sources that have survived that are contemporary with Nero's own life. How much can we believe about what was written about Nero? Well, first of all, let's get a little bit of context on Emperor Nero. Nero was the fourth and final emperor to come from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The Julio-Claudians were the family that traced their roots to the original Caesars, Julius and Augustus. These were the people who essentially put an end to the Roman Republic and invented the office of emperor. In the history of Rome, the Julio-Claudians are kind of a big deal, and I'm always amazed at how many bad emperors this family produced after the death of Augustus himself. Immediately after the office of princeps, the early title for the emperors, is established, almost all of the men who inherit the office will prove to be some of Rome's worst leaders. Men like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero are remembered by history as some of the most murderous and debauched people to have ever lived. Nero was proclaimed emperor at the young age of 17, a fact that many ancient historians point to as the reason for Nero's later corruption. Essentially, he was the ultimate spoiled brat. He succeeded his grand-uncle Claudius, an unlikely but surprisingly effective emperor who overcame a childhood stutter to become one of Rome's finest princeps since Augustus. But despite Claudius's admirable administrative record, his reign was troubled by family drama and dynastic politics. Many ancient historians openly accuse Nero's mother, Agrippina, of poisoning Claudius in service of the young, ambitious Nero. For the Game of Thrones fans in the crowd, Agrippina is sort of like the Cersei Lannister of this whole situation. She was the conniving mother of the king, constantly accused of incest. Claudius had been her uncle, after all, who is a master of palace intrigue and willing to go to murderous ends to secure her own power. And if Agrippina is the Cersei, then the young Nero is the perfect sub-in for Prince Joffrey, the cocky young heir apparent who chafes against his mother's attempts to control him. Nonetheless, young Nero seems to have been a popular emperor with the average man on the street, as many of his policies directly pandered to their interests. The people who really hated Nero seem to have been the privileged senatorial class, who the young emperor seemed to enjoy snubbing. Now, the writers of the histories were, of course, members of this elite senatorial class, so it's their version of Nero that we are left with. Every excess, indiscretion, and salacious rumor tends to be given credence by these authors, so getting a clear picture of the man can be difficult. Even historians writing decades after Nero's death commented on the noticeable bias in the historical record. Tacitus, probably the most reasonable of the Roman historians, points out that the histories written from Nero's own time were, quote, falsified through terror, and after his death were written under the irritation of a recent hatred, end quote. This is supported by the Jewish historian Josephus, who writes of the historians who trashed Nero, quote, out of hatred to him and the great ill will which they bore him, have so impudently raved against him with their lies, and they justly deserve to be condemned, end quote. However, even if we accept that the sources are biased, rarely in the Roman world are lies made up entirely out of whole cloth, except for sometimes. In our quest for balance, we shouldn't swing too far in the other direction. I think it's safe to assume that although Nero may not have been the Antichrist, he may have not have been a great guy either. So what crimes appear on Nero's rap sheet? Well, first and foremost is his possible involvement in Claudius's death, although many historians, both modern and ancient, are happy to pin that one on Agrippina. Less controversial is Nero's involvement in the death of Agrippina herself. Most sources seem to agree that Nero, annoyed by his mother's meddling, had Agrippina killed. Now this is an awesome story. Tacitus tells us that Nero put Agrippina on a boat outfitted with a lead ceiling above his mother's chambers. At exactly the right moment, the crew was to cause the ceiling to collapse, which would crush Agrippina. Then the boat would sink, conveniently hiding up all the evidence. Well, Agrippina turned out to be much more canny, not to mention agile, than anyone could have expected. When the ceiling came crashing down, the emperor's mother jumped out of bed and dodged the falling debris, leaving only an unlucky servant to be crushed. Agrippina then managed to make it above decks and jumped off the boat and tried to swim for it. She was nearly clubbed to death by a murderous oarsman trying to win some favor by finishing the job. But he got distracted by one of Agrippina's friends who had also been aboard. The woman apparently thought that she would be rescued if she screamed out that she was Agrippina. All that did was distract the oarsman, who promptly put the false Agrippina out of her misery. Meanwhile, the real Agrippina made it to shore, where she was met by a group of cheering supporters. This death-defying escape would prove to be for naught, as Nero was pretty intent on having her killed. When he learned that his mother had survived, Nero dispensed with any illusions of it being a convenient accident and simply sent 3 men to stab his mother. So Nero was almost certainly guilty of matricide. So if you were harboring any hope that maybe Nero was secretly a great guy, it's time to let that hope die. But surely there's got to be more to justify Nero's horrible reputation. Well, the young emperor was a partier and was known to host wild orgies and cut a swath through Rome's nightlife. Nero and his buddies were known to carouse around town and were fond of making scenes at the brothels and alehouses in the capital. Young Nero also had a massive ego and would often neglect affairs of state in order to practice his lyre. This was the small harp that was popular in the Greco-Roman world. Apparently, Nero was known to make his counselors and foreign dignitaries sit through interminable lyre recitals. Nero was known to perform in plays as well, where attendance was mandatory. Now, this might not sound so bad to us, but to the Romans, being an entertainer was the lowest form of scum in their society. In ancient Rome, actors existed on a social rung lower than prostitutes. Having your emperor perform on stage was almost as scandalous as having him sell his body on the street. But it is here that we can find the roots of the fiddling story. So to recap, we have a matricidal egomaniac fond of plucking his lyre. Sounds like a piece of crap, but hardly the Antichrist. In fact, the heart of Nero's infamy is deeply linked to the fire of 64 AD. The fire and its aftermath continue to hang like a thick fog over Nero's historical image. So what was the Great Fire? To give you a full understanding of the horror of the fire, let's read from Tacitus, the only source who was in Rome when it happened. Now started the most terrible and destructive fire which Rome had ever experienced. It began in the circus, where it adjoins the Palatine and Cælian hills. Breaking out in shops selling inflammable goods, and fanned by the wind, the conflagration instantly grew and swept the whole length of the circus. There were no walled mansions or temples, or any other obstructions which could arrest it. First, the fire swept violently over the level spaces. Then it climbed the hills, but returned to ravage the lower ground again. It outstripped every countermeasure. The ancient city's narrow, winding streets and irregular blocks encountered its progress. Terrified, shrieking women, helpless old and young, people intent on their own safety, people unselfishly supporting invalids or waiting for them, fugitives and lingerers alike, all heightened the confusion. When people looked back, menacing flames sprang up before them or outflanked them. When they escaped to a neighboring quarter, the fire followed. Even districts believed remote proved to be involved. Finally, with no idea where or what to flee, they crowded on the country roads or lay in the fields. Some who had lost everything, even their food for the day, could have escaped, but preferred to die. So did others who had failed to rescue their loved ones. Nobody dared to fight the flames. Attempts to do so were prevented by menacing gangs. Torches, too, were openly thrown in, by men crying that they had acted under orders. Perhaps they had received orders, or they may have just wanted to plunder unhampered. By the sixth day, enormous demolitions had confronted the raging flames with bare ground and open sky, and the fire was finally stamped out at the foot of the Esquiline Hill. But before panic had subsided, or hope revived, flames broke out again in the more open regions of the city. Here there were fewer casualties, but the destruction of temples and pleasure arcades was even worse. This new conflagration caused additional ill feeling, because it started on Tigellinus' estate in the Aemilian district. For the people believed that Nero was ambitious to found a new city to be called after himself. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained intact. 3 were leveled to the ground. The other 7 were reduced to a few scorched and mangled ruins. Tacitus's breathless recollection really helps hammer home the desperate horror this kind of event conjures up. Now imagine you're one of those Romans who lost everything in the fire, and you start to hear a rumor. Remember those men we saw adding fuel to the flames? Those men were sent by the emperor. We all know Nero wanted to build a new palace and some prime downtown real estate. This was his perfect chance. I even heard he laughed as he watched the city burn and even publicly plucked his lyre. I even heard he used the flames as a backdrop for some sick play he was performing for his upper crust buddies. And so went the rumor mill. Now, the fiddle was a much later addition to the story, as fiddles didn't exist in first century Rome. The original story was that Nero played the lyre as Rome burned. Later bastardizations of the story would replace the instrument with something more modern. And I can completely see how this anachronism caught on. Just having the emperor playing any old instrument might not convey the appropriate tone of the story. We can't have people thinking that Nero was plucking out a sad ode to his dying city. Oh no, we need something jaunty. And nothing says, I don't give an F, like the fiddle. But was there anything to these rumors? Well, Nero's response to the fire definitely seemed shady and opportunistic. He did end up appropriating large swaths of land destroyed by the fire at the bottom of the Palatine Hill and used it to build yet another opulent palace. In keeping with our 9/11 analogy, the tragedy was somewhat cynically used to push through a plan that had most likely been in the works for some time. However, cynically taking advantage of a tragedy and actively causing a tragedy are two very different things. And most of the reliable evidence suggests that Nero had nothing to do with starting the fire. Even old Tacitus, who clearly has no love for Nero, lets the emperor off the hook. Tacitus tells us, quote, Nero was at Antium. He returned to the city only when the fire was approaching the mansion he had built to link the gardens of the Mycenaeans to the Palatine. The flames could not be prevented from overwhelming the whole of the Palatine, including his palace. Nevertheless, for the relief of the homeless fugitive masses, he threw open the Field of Mars, including Agrippa's public buildings, and even his own gardens. Nero also constructed emergency accommodation for the destitute multitude. Food was brought in from Ostia and neighboring towns, and the price of corn was cut to less than a quarter of a sesterce a pound. Yet these measures, for all their popular character, earned him no gratitude. For a rumor had spread that while the city was burning, Nero had gone on his private stage and, comparing modern calamities with ancient, had sung of the destruction of Troy. End quote. Interestingly, Tacitus cast Nero as a victim of a salacious rumor, despite the emperor's honest attempts to direct a relief effort. According to Tacitus, Nero wasn't even in town when the fire started, and much of his own palace was destroyed in the conflagration. Also, the fire didn't begin in the part of town that was later used for the reconstructed palace. It actually began several neighborhoods away. This also helps Nero's cause, because if you're going to start a fire in hopes of clearing some land, it makes no sense to start it in the wrong spot altogether. Starting a fire in one neighborhood and hoping it spreads to the next doesn't seem like the choice made by an arsonist with a clear goal in mind. The fact that so much of the emperor's own personal property was destroyed in the fire is another strong indication that Nero probably had nothing to do with it. Many of the rooms and frescoes that were destroyed in the old palace were recreated almost exactly in the new palace. These are not the actions of a man who wanted to watch Rome burn. The truth is that the ancient city was a tinderbox, and it was a miracle that it hadn't had a more serious fire before this point. Unlike the provincial towns the Romans had wisely designed on a rational grid system, the capital had no such urban planning. It was an overstuffed mess of alleyways and crisscrossing lanes that were often too narrow to support the immense amount of traffic that would push through them on a daily basis. In reality, it was only a matter of time before a large-scale fire broke out in this city. 64 AD just happened to be the unlucky year, and Nero was the unlucky emperor. So Nero didn't start the fire, nor did he fiddle or pluck his lyre while Rome burned. But the rumor was out there and it was spreading fast. The people were shocked and angry and looking for someone to blame, and right now their young, haughty emperor seemed like a good person as any. Nero's popularity had hit an all-time low, and despite his attempts to play the savior of his city, his efforts had proved useless. Now Nero needed a scapegoat, and the fledgling Christian sect seemed as good a group as any. At this time, the Christians would have composed a tiny minority of the city's population. This was, after all, only 30 years after Jesus is thought to have been crucified. Most of the Christians living in Rome would have been immigrants from the East and would have spoke Hebrew or Greek as their first language. Their ceremonies were secretive and exotic to the Romans, and they were rumored to engage in a type of cannibalism. Word wasn't out yet that the flesh and blood of the communion was just bread and wine. The Christians were also stubbornly monotheistic, and they refused to worship any other god except for their own, including the deified emperors. To the pagan Romans, this unwillingness to participate in the multitude of religious rites performed for dozens of deities, it seemed odd and weirdly antisocial. Eventually, this stubbornness would lead to endless conflicts between the Christians and Roman authorities. But in 64 AD, the Christians were still so few in numbers that they just remained a strange Eastern curiosity. Nero seized on the fact that these people looked different, worshipped strange gods, and were largely foreigners who didn't even speak Latin. He began spreading his own rumor that it was the Christians who had started the fire, and then proceeded to arrest a few well-known members of the sect. These unlucky few were tortured until they gave up the names of other Christians living in Rome. Eventually, Nero was able to round up a sizable group of hapless Christians and devised a number of gruesome public executions. Tacitus tells us that Nero had some of his victims dressed in animal hides and chased by wild dogs until they collapsed from exhaustion and were torn to pieces. Others were crucified and then set on fire so they could act as human street lamps to light Nero's gardens, which the emperor magnanimously threw open to the public for the event. The historian also includes the detail that Nero himself mingled among the common people in the costume of a chariot driver, apparently thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of burning human beings. So if we believe Tacitus, then Nero didn't start the fire, but he still managed to pull a stunt that made him look like a supervillain. If he was trying to erase the image of him using the burning city as a backdrop for one of his lyre concerts from the city's mind, playing charioteer while human beings were burnt alive for amusement doesn't really seem like the way to do it. Even to a pagan Roman like Tacitus, who clearly has no love for the Christians, this grisly spectacle seemed a bit much. According to his account, the usually bloodthirsty Roman mob actually felt some sympathy for the persecuted Christians. It's in this act that we have the root of Nero's demonic reputation. Many Roman sources, like Suetonius, are much less charitable to Nero than even Tacitus, and the Christian writers who would come later, well, for them, Nero was understandably the stuff of nightmares. This was, after all, the first imperially sanctioned persecution of the Christians, and a particularly gruesome one at that. Church historians would later claim that the Apostle Peter himself was one of Nero's victims. In church lore, the name Nero would become nearly synonymous with Satan. When Christians eventually had their turn to edit the historical record, any histories at all sympathetic to Nero were systematically purged. As a result, the Christian image of the emperor as a sadist from hell has been the image that stuck. Nero would eventually commit suicide in 68 AD after a few powerful generals revolted and the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. However, the emperor did not seem to fade from the public imagination, and soon a legend sprouted that Nero had not actually died. The so-called Nero Redivivus myth held that the emperor's suicide had been faked and that he had escaped and was hiding out in the Eastern Empire. The story went that the emperor was secretly raising an army, and he would one day return to conquer Rome. As the years passed, and the escaped Nero would have eventually become impossibly old, the story evolved to suggest that Nero had been kept eternally young by some black magic. In Christian legend, the story of the returned Nero became deeply linked with the concept of the Antichrist. Many modern biblical scholars have pointed out that the Book of Revelations has many possible allusions to the Nero Redivivus myth. The number of the beast itself has been explained as a veiled numerological shout-out to Nero. Apparently the number 666, when read in Greek, rhymes with the Hebrew for Emperor Nero Caesar. Esoteric, I know, but such is the world of ancient numerology. In Revelations, the coming of the Antichrist, aka 666, aka Nero, was the ultimate sign of the end times. So, suffice it to say, Nero loomed large in the dark imaginations of early Christians. Pretenders to the throne also managed to use the myth that Nero was alive and well for their own ambitions to power. There were at least 3 Nero imposters that popped up in the years after the real emperor's death. Historians have dubbed these imposters the pseudo-Neros. The first appeared in Greece and was said to have greatly resembled the former emperor, and even more convincingly, he played the liar. He was able to amass a small group of followers in the Greek islands before being executed by Roman officials. The next appeared in the eastern province of Asia and was similarly talented at the liar. But his cause was just as doomed as the first pseudo-Nero, and he was also quickly killed. The third impostor was perhaps the most successful, as he gained the support of Rome's ancient rivals, the Parthians. Eventually, the Parthians were persuaded to hand over their pseudo-Nero, but only after it looked like the whole matter could come to war. Now, although these pretenders never even came close to threatening imperial power, it should be noted how quickly all of them were executed by the powers that be. Clearly, the myth still had power, and you couldn't have young men with scraggly blonde hair and a knack for the liar getting any ideas. In the end, historians are still torn over what to believe about Nero. When even your most reliable sources, like Tacitus, are still deeply biased, it becomes nearly impossible to say anything with surety. It could be quite possible that all of the tyrannical acts attributed to Nero were invented by the ancient historians to please their current emperors, the men who had deposed Nero. Nonetheless, it's hard for me to believe that the emperor is simply the hapless victim of character assassination. Nero's memory haunted his empire, even giving birth to a myth of an unaging zombie intent on reconquering Rome. If you ask me, reputations like that don't come unearned. Even if Nero wasn't the bloodthirsty sadist described by Tacitus or Suetonius, he still must have been a figure that inspired a unique type of dread in his people. In a way, he transcended the bounds of being a historical figure and became more like a mythological creature. He was the stock supervillain of the ancient world, sort of like the Joker in Batman. Except instead of clown makeup, his gimmick was that he played a tiny Roman harp. All of that aside, one thing that is fairly certain, that for all of his crimes, real or imagined, Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned. He didn't even have a fiddle. And much to the chagrin of all those Nero truthers still out there, the Great Fire of 64 probably wasn't an inside job. Just another example of how a real story can get lost when a real good story turns up to take its place. And that brings us to the end of our episode this week. Join us again in 2 weeks' time and we'll pick apart another historical myth. If you like the show, please drop us a line at ourfakehistory@gmail.com. If you were really impressed with the show, you can show your gratitude by writing us a nice review on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at ourfakehistory or check in with us at our website at ourfakehistory.com. The theme music is provided by Dirty Church, who can be found on Facebook or at dirtychurch.bandcamp.com. All other music on the show is written and recorded by me. My name is Sebastian Major. Thanks again for listening. And just remember, just because it didn't happen doesn't mean it's not real.